There's a particular sound I still listen for every summer morning. Coffee in hand, standing at the edge of my garden. It's not loud. You almost have to be still to notice it. The low, steady hum of bees working through a patch of flowers, like there's nowhere else in the world they need to be. I didn't always have that sound in my yard. For years, my garden was pretty enough, but quiet in a way I didn't notice until I fixed it. What changed things was native wildflowers, plants like coneflower, which brings the bees in by the dozen. Milkweed, which is the only plant a monarch caterpillar can actually eat. And Cardinal flower, whose bright red blooms will bring a hummingbird close enough that you can hear its wings. Today, I want to share those 3, plus 5 more that have earned a permanent place in my garden. Some like it dry, some like it wet, and every one of them will bring your yard to life in a way that's hard to describe until you've stood in the middle of it yourself. Let's take a walk through them together. Purple coneflower. Before I get into the first one, I want to be honest about something, because it matters for all 8 of these. Native wildflowers aren't a shortcut to instant beauty. Most take a season, sometimes 2, to really settle in. And that first year often looks thin, not because you've done anything wrong, but because the plant is putting its early energy into roots you can't see. Hold on to that patience. And what follows is worth the wait. I'll start with the one that started it all for me, because it's often where people begin. And for good reason. Purple coneflower is easy to pick out once you know what you're looking for. Tall, sturdy stems topped with daisy-like blooms, pale to deep purple petals that droop slightly downward from a raised, spiky orange-brown center. That center cone is really the whole point. Botanically speaking, it's packed with the tiny individual flowers that bees and butterflies are actually after. And it gives the plant its common name. This is a plant that wants sun, real sun, at least 6 hours a day. And it isn't fussy about soil the way some flowers can be. Average, well-drained soil suits it fine. And once it's established, usually after that first full growing season, it handles dry spells without much complaint. It's hardy across a wide stretch of the country, comfortable in what gardeners call USDA hardiness zones, 3 through 9, which is just a simple way of describing how cold a winter a plant can survive. Based on your general region, if you're not sure of your zone, a quick search with your zip code will tell you carry. Once it's settled in, is about as simple as it gets. Deadheading, meaning snipping off the spent blooms, will encourage more flowers through the season. Though I'll admit, I often leave the last round of blooms standing into fall, because the seed heads bring in goldfinches who perch right on top and pick them clean. Bees are drawn to coneflower constantly through the blooming season, and it's one of the more reliable butterfly plants you can grow, particularly for swallowtails. My tip for anyone just starting out: don't buy a single plant expecting a big show right away. Coneflower spreads gradually on its own over a few years. So plant 3 or 4 together if your budget allows, and give it time to fill in rather than judging it too quickly by that first thin season. There's also a quiet reward that comes later in the season, once the petals have dropped and only that spiky cone remains standing. Those seed heads are sturdy enough to hold through wind and rain, and they'll keep working for you well past the flower's prime, feeding birds right through into winter if you let them stand. Black-eyed Susan. If coneflower is the plant that opened my eyes, Black-eyed Susan is the one that never once let me down. You'll know it by its bright, almost impossibly cheerful golden yellow petals surrounding a dark brown, dome-shaped center. It has a way of catching the eye from across the yard, even on an overcast day, which is part of why it's become such a familiar sight along roadsides and meadows throughout the country. It asks for full sun, though it will tolerate a bit of light afternoon shade without much fuss. And it grows happily in soil that many other flowers would turn their nose up at poor. A little rocky, not particularly rich. That adaptability is part of its charm. It's hardy roughly in zones 3 through 9, much the same range as Coneflower, which is part of why the two are so often planted side by side. Once established, Black-Eyed Susan needs very little from you. It's genuinely drought-tolerant. And it isn't picky about watering once its roots have settled in over that first season. Many varieties behave as short-lived perennials, meaning they may only stick around a few years before fading. But they self-seed readily, dropping seed that sprouts new plants nearby. So a patch tends to sustain itself and even spread a little on its own without you doing much of anything. Bees are drawn to it steadily through summer. And it's a genuinely important source of nectar for a range of native bee species. Along with being a favorite of several butterflies, my tip here, resist the urge to deadhead every single spent bloom if you want that self-seeding to happen. Leave a portion of the flower head standing through late summer and into fall, and you'll likely find volunteer seedlings coming up nearby the following spring, filling in the patch for free. San, butterfly milkweed. Now here's one with a very particular, very important job, and it's worth slowing down for. Butterfly milkweed is easy to spot by its clusters of brilliant orange flowers, blooming in flat-topped groups atop stiff, upright stems. Unlike some of its milkweed relatives, it doesn't have the milky sap that gives the family its name, at least not in any noticeable amount, which makes it a bit more garden-friendly for anyone who's cautious about that trait. It wants full sun and, notably, prefers soil on the drier, leaner side. It actually resents rich, consistently moist soil, and it's prone to rot if it sits in wet ground for extended periods. That makes it a wonderful choice for a hot, dry corner of the yard where other flowers tend to struggle. It's hardy in zones 3 through 9, adapting to a wide range of climates as long as the drainage is right. Once established, it's low maintenance almost to a fault. And I'd caution you against over-loving it with extra water or rich soil, since that kindness tends to work against it here. It can also be slow to emerge in spring, sometimes not showing signs of life until quite late. So don't assume it's died over winter if you don't see growth as early as your other perennials. The reason this one matters so much goes beyond ordinary pollinator appeal. Milkweed, in all its native forms, is the only plant monarch butterfly caterpillars can eat, which makes it essential to the monarch's entire life cycle. Not just a nice nectar stop for adult butterflies passing through. Planting it is a small, direct way of supporting a species that's had a genuinely hard time in recent decades. My tip: plant it away from foot traffic and mowing, since the caterpillars will strip the leaves down considerably in late summer, and that's actually the plant doing exactly what it's meant to do. Not a sign of trouble. Balm. I want to introduce this next one through the visitors it brings, because that's really where its reputation comes from. Bee balm has a wonderfully wild, almost shaggy-looking bloom, a spray of narrow, tubular petals radiating outward from a central hub, most commonly in shades of red, pink, or purple depending on the variety. Crush a leaf between your fingers and you'll catch a scent reminiscent of mint or oregano, which makes sense. Since it belongs to the same plant family, it grows best in full sun to partial shade. And unlike butterfly milkweed, it actually prefers soil that stays consistently moist, doing especially well near the edge of a rain garden or a low spot in the yard that holds a bit more water than the rest. It's hardy roughly in zones 4 through 9. One thing worth knowing upfront: bee balm can be prone to powdery mildew, a white, dusty-looking fungal issue on the leaves, particularly in humid climates or crowded plantings. Giving plants good airflow by spacing them generously and choosing mildew-resistant varieties where you can find them makes a real difference here. As the name suggests, bees are drawn to it readily. But it's the red-flowered varieties in particular that seem to catch a hummingbird's attention almost immediately. Those tubular blooms are practically built for a hummingbird's long, narrow beak. If you've been hoping to see more hummingbirds in your yard, bee balm is one of the most direct ways to invite them in. My tip for beginners: plant it somewhere with a little breathing room around it, rather than crowding it against a fence or wall, since good air circulation goes a long way toward keeping that mildew issue at bay. It also spreads over time by underground runners, filling in a patch more generously than some of the other flowers here. That's a welcome trait if you've got the space for it, though it's worth keeping an eye on if you're working with a smaller, more contained bed, since it will happily wander further than you originally planted it. Woo! Blazing star. This next one tends to surprise people, mostly because it doesn't look like what most of us picture when we think wildflower. Blazing star grows in tall, narrow spikes densely packed with small, fuzzy purple flowers. And here's the detail that catches people off guard. It blooms from the top of the spike downward, which is the reverse of how most spike-flowering plants behave. Once you notice it, you can't unnotice it. It wants full sun and does best in soil that drains well, tolerating average to slightly poor conditions without much complaint once established. It's hardy in roughly zones 3 through 9, and, like butterfly milkweed, handles drought reasonably well once its roots have had a season to settle in. Kari is minimal. It doesn't typically need dividing or fussing over, and it holds up well to a bit of neglect. The corms, which are the bulb-like structures beneath the soil, can be prone to rot in consistently soggy ground. So good drainage really is the one condition worth paying attention to when you're choosing a spot. Butterflies, particularly swallowtails and monarchs during their fall migration south, are drawn to blazing star in noticeable numbers. And it's a genuinely strong late summer nectar source at a point in the season when some earlier bloomers have already faded. My tip: plant it toward the back or middle of a bed, since its height, often 2 to 4 feet, can shade out shorter neighbors if it's placed at the front without some planning. Luke, New England Aster. I want to bring this one in through the calendar, because it solves a problem a lot of pollinator gardens run into. New England Aster produces masses of small, daisy-like flowers in shades of deep purple to pink, with a bright yellow center, blooming on branching stems that can reach 3 to 6 feet tall in good conditions. It has a slightly ragged, informal look that fits naturally into a wildflower planting rather than a tidy, manicured bed. It grows well in full sun to partial shade and appreciates soil that holds a bit of moisture rather than drying out completely, though it's more adaptable than some moisture lovers once it's established. It's hardy in zones 3 through 8, tolerating cold winters without much trouble. The real gift of New England Aster is timing. It blooms in September and often well into October, right as most of the rest of the garden is winding down for the year, which makes it one of the last significant nectar sources available before frost. For that reason alone, it does a huge amount of good for pollinators preparing for winter or, in the case of monarchs, fueling up for their long migration south. Bees rely on it heavily in early fall, when other food sources have largely disappeared, And it draws a steady stream of butterflies as well during that same stretch. My tip for beginners if you want a bushier, more compact plant rather than a tall, floppy one. Pinch back the stems by about 1/3 in early summer. It delays the bloom only slightly and results in a fuller, sturdier plant that won't need staking later in the season. Joe-Pye weed. This one earns its place on the list mostly through sheer scale. And it deserves a mention for gardeners who have the room for it. Joe-Pye weed is a substantial plant, often reaching 5 to 7 feet tall in good conditions. Topped with large, dusty pink to mauve flower clusters that seem to hum with activity the entire time they're in bloom. It's not a plant for a small container garden, but for anyone with a spacious bed or a naturalized corner of the yard, it makes a genuine statement. It grows best in full sun to partial shade and, notably, prefers soil that stays consistently moist. It's often found naturally along stream banks and in low, damp meadows. That makes it an excellent choice for a spot in your yard that tends to stay wetter than the rest. The kind of area where a lot of other perennials struggle. It's hardy in zones 4 through 8. Because of its height, it benefits from a bit of planting around placement toward the back of a bed. Or somewhere, it won't shade out shorter neighbors. It doesn't typically need staking if it's getting enough sun. Since good light keeps the stems sturdy rather than leggy and weak, butterflies are drawn to Joe-Pye weed in real numbers. And it's a particular favorite of swallowtails, who will often work a single flower cluster for extended stretches. My tip, if the height feels like too much of a commitment, look for one of the more compact cultivars bred to stay closer to 3 or 4 feet, which gives you the same pollinator appeal in a smaller footprint. Cardinal flower. I've saved this last one for a particular reason, because it's the flower most likely to bring hummingbirds right up to your window. Cardinal flower produces tall spikes of vivid, almost impossibly bright red tubular blooms, standing out sharply against green foliage in a way that's hard to miss even from a distance. It has an elegance to it that feels a little different from the more rustic look of some of the other flowers on this list. It wants full sun to partial shade and, like Joe-Pye weed, prefers consistently moist soil. It's genuinely at home near a pond edge, a low spot that collects rainwater, or the damp margin of a rain garden. It's hardy in zones 3 through 9, though it can be a touch particular about surviving harsh winters in the coldest parts of that range, especially without reliable snow cover for insulation. It can be somewhat short-lived as a perennial in some gardens, but it self-seeds readily in the right conditions, so a planting often sustains itself over the years, even as individual plants come and go. A layer of mulch over winter offers some extra protection in colder climates. Here's the detail that makes this flower special. Those long, tubular red blooms are almost perfectly shaped for a hummingbird's beak. And it's genuinely one of the most reliable hummingbird plants you can grow. If a hummingbird visits your yard at all during the growing season, Cardinal flower is very likely to bring it in close, often right at eye level if you've planted it near a porch or window. My tip: keep the soil around it consistently moist, especially through its first season, since letting it dry out is the most common reason new plantings struggle to establish. So there you have it, 8 wildflowers, each one bringing something a little different to a garden: early bloomers and late ones, plants for dry corners, and plants for damp ones. Flowers that call in bees by the dozen, and flowers built almost specifically for a single, hovering hummingbird. I think what I love most about this kind of gardening is how little it actually asks of you once it's established. These aren't demanding plants. They're not looking for constant fertilizer, constant watering, constant fussing. What they're looking for is simply the right spot, and then the patience to let them do what they've been doing in the wild for longer than any of us have been alive. And what you get in return if you're patient with it, is genuinely hard to put into words until you've experienced it yourself. That low hum of bees on a summer morning, a monarch stopping to feed instead of just passing through, a hummingbird hovering close enough that you can hear its wings. It changes how a yard feels. Not just how it looks. You don't need to plant all 8 at once. Either. Pick the 1 or 2 that match the conditions you already have: a dry, sunny slope, a damp low corner, a spot near a window where you'd love to watch a hummingbird up close and let the rest wait for another season. A pollinator garden built slowly, one honest choice at a time, tends to hold together better than one planted all in a rush. If you decide to try even 1 or 2 of these, I'd love to hear about it. Tell me in the comments which one you're starting with, or which pollinators already visit your yard, or what's worked for you over the years. I read every comment, and I always learn something from them. If this video was helpful, I hope you'll consider subscribing. There's more gardening conversation like this coming, built around the same idea that a garden doesn't need to be complicated to be full of life. Welcome home to Easy Garden. I'll see you next time.